want to begin with a fragment from a famous poem by Czesław Miłosz, which some of you probably know, called Poem for the End of the Century. When everything was fine, and the notion of sin had vanished, and the earth was ready in universal peace to consume and rejoice without creeds or utopias, I, for unknown reasons, surrounded by the books of prophets and theologians, philosophers, poets, searched for an answer, scowling, grimacing, waking up at night, muttering at dawn. What oppressed me so much was a bit shameful. Talking of it aloud would show neither tact nor prudence. It might even seem an outrage against the health of mankind. While Czesław Miłosz was waking up at night in the 1990s, everyone else was sleeping comfortably. The end of the Cold War, indeed the end of the Long War, which began in 1914 and ended in 1989, had left the world in peace and discredited the utopian creeds that had led to so much suffering in the preceding 75 years. What Miłosz foresaw, however, was the beginning of a series of increasingly unsettling events that the glorious end of the war and the American preeminence that followed had not led us to expect. My thesis is that what appeared to be separate, troubling, disassociated events in this period are in fact functions of a deep change in the nature of the state, not just the American state, but of all states in the developed world. Since the birth of the modern state in Europe in the 16th century, historians and statesmen have thought of the state as a kind of stage on which the principal actors, political, bureaucratic, military, diplomatic, strutted and fretted. After the Renaissance, political philosophers have taken the neoclassical state as a given, a basic framework within which events occurred, like space and time for Newtonian mechanics. According to the theories of state evolution, which I have endeavored to describe in my work, however, the stage itself periodically springs into action. Pulled by strategic innovations, pushed by constitutional mutations, the state could renounce its own basis for legitimacy, declare new forms of the constitutional order that depended upon new bases for legitimacy, and remake the international order in its own image. Insurgent constitutional orders could appear and be smothered, or they might sweep away the status quo and replace it after a single epochal war that put the legitimacy of the state in play and awarded the status of international preeminence to the most strategically dynamic constitutional form. The mutually affecting field relationship between strategy and law directs the state how to change in order to preserve its legitimacy. The prevailing constitutional order shows the state how to resolve the tragic choices out of which strategy and law emerge. In my view, it is no longer sensible to describe events in the life of the state, terrorism, financial collapse, alliance creation and maintenance, governance itself, without specifying the conditions of the prevailing constitutional order. Most of the time, for most of our lives, all of my life, this has not been difficult. Just as, to continue the analogy, Newtonian mechanics is fine for planets or for artillery shells or spitballs. For more than a century, most of the states of the developed world have lived within the constitutional order of the industrial nation state. So when we talked about current affairs, it wasn't necessary to specify the placement of the furniture and the scrims on the stage. The stage was set, as it always has been in our recent memory. But sometimes, if rarely, the stage is put in motion, and its transformation is itself as much a cause as it is the effect of the deeply unsettling events in the life of the constitutional order. Many years ago, I criticized the use in social science of Newtonian mechanical models of the physical sciences, because these models characteristically overemphasize structure and they minimize the importance of change over time. Based on steady-state dynamics, a mechanical model is essentially static. It is assumed the system will return to a state of equilibrium following any perturbation, like a war or a revolution or a depression. This afternoon, I will describe a transition that will command all the developed states, the transition from an industrial nation state to an informational market state. No important question in our constitutional and international lives, which I will argue are themselves closely connected, can be understood if this development, a change in the nature of the state itself, is ignored. Understanding this evolution will become important to us if we are to overcome what might be called the Westphalian fallacy, the notion that the modern state has had only one continuous constitutional order since 1648, to which it must always return despite the occasional embarrassing disturbance. I spent many hours attempting to show that this is historically suspect, that wars and revolutions have brought forth an evolution through several constitutional orders of the modern state. But this afternoon, let me just call attention to one pernicious result of this fallacy. If we assume there can be only one constitutional order of the state, then we must either blind ourselves to fundamental challenges to that order, or we will make the even more egregious mistake of concluding that the state itself is withering away. In fact, there have been at least 5 distinct constitutional orders since the collapse of feudalism in the 16th century. Standing at the beginning of the creation of the modern neoclassical state, Machiavelli described a cycle of growth and decay of classical states. Monarchies decay into tyrannies, aristocracies into oligarchies, republics into democracies, each degraded order deriving from its superior form, to which we might apply the nomenclature of the various constitutional orders of the modern state, from the princely states of the 16th century, which were monarchies, to the kingly states of the 17th century that were tyrannies, la TASM, to the territorial states of the 18th century dominated by aristocracies, to the imperial states of the 19th century run by oligarchies, to the republics of the 20th century, industrial nation states, to the now emerging informational market states of the 21st century that are something approaching direct democracies. The triumph of the 20th century parliamentary industrial nation state was a triumph of the liberal Enlightenment. As Robert Kagan recently wrote, that project elevated universal principles of individual rights and common humanity over ethnic, racial, religious, national, or tribal differences. It looked to a growing economic interdependence to create common interest across boundaries and to the establishment of international institutions to smooth differences and facilitate cooperation among the nations. Above all, it looked at law to tame the market domestically and control interstate violence internationally. As Kagan observed, unsuccessful and costly wars in Korea in 1950, Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, and previous grievous economic downturns, even as recently as the energy crisis and the stagflation of the 70s, did not have the effect of turning America against global involvement. Now fast forward to the last 25 years. That is, the years since the zenith of that triumph. Now, the democratic order has been weakened and fractured at its core. Difficult economic conditions, the resurgence of nationalism and tribalism, weak and uncertain political leadership, unresponsive mainstream political parties, and a new era of communications that seems to strengthen rather than weaken tribalism, have together produced a crisis of confidence not only in the democracies, but in the liberal Enlightenment project itself. Unlike our experiences in Vietnam and Korea, and with the economic crises of the 1970s, the unsuccessful wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the financial meltdown of 2008 have turned Americans against foreign involvement, global institutions, against our own history. Why? What's going on? In March of last year, the journalist Matthew Iglesias wrote, "Someday, not tomorrow, next year, probably sometime before climate change forces us to seek space colonies, there's going to be a collapse of the American legal and political order and its replacement by something else. If we're lucky, it won't be violent. If we're lucky, it will lead us to tackle the underlying problems and result in a better, more robust political system. Iglesias' essay was picked up by a number of critics and commentators. All of them seemed to believe that the problem was institutional gridlock, and the solution of enhanced executive power would or would not produce something like a kind of presidential dictatorship. Dylan Matthews wrote, "Much likelier is a continuation of the executive's gradual consolidation of power until the presidency is something like an elective dictatorship. It won't happen in a big bang. No individual step will feel like a massive tyranny." Some commentators thought the end of the American state was a realistic possibility. Others did not. Critics described a long list of difficulties and headwinds facing the U.S. system. These descriptions strike me as both horrifying and unimaginative. Like many scenarios of our future, they treat states as if they were chess pieces, unchanged as they move through time across the international chessboard. I think a more accurate portrait of the last 2.5 decades would show that all of these threatening developments, which we may be inclined to see as separate elements, the financial meltdown, the rise of terrorism, the collapse of international institutions, Srebrenica, what has that got in common with the rise and support of the Rwanda? That all of these are elements, I believe, of an impending change in the constitutional order of states. For make no mistake about it, the American constitutional system as it exists today could be said to be in a process of collapse if by that we meant a metamorphosis into a new constitutional order, something with a new basis for legitimacy. It has happened before. We live in industrial nation states, a constitutional order that emerged not after Westphalia, but in the United States after the Civil War and in Germany after unification. The watermark of any particular constitutional order is its claim to legitimacy. Give us power, the nation state said, and we will improve your material well-being. Lloyd George said that. Franklin Roosevelt said it. But so did Vladimir Lenin, and so did Adolf Hitler, because they were all leaders of the same constitutional order of the state, although they had very different ideas about how to accomplish this. The constitutional order of the industrial nation state brought us mass free education, the mass voting franchise, including not only propertyless males but also females, old age pensions, unemployment compensation, the public funding of science, state-owned enterprises like airlines, railroads, telecommunications, energy. But it also brought total warfare. That is, it brought warfare against the nation. The constitutional order of the industrial nation state superseded that of the imperial state nations of the late 19th and the late 18th and early 19th centuries. That constitutional order made its claim to legitimacy on the basis of unifying the state with the nation. Now, we live for so long in nation states, you may be inclined to think of those words as synonymous. But of course, a nation is not a state. Indeed, there are many nations, Palestinians, for example, the Cherokee, that do not have states. The imperial state nation promised to unite the state with the nation, by which it meant the dominant historical, cultural, linguistic, ethnic popular group. Washington, Hamilton, and Madison, but also Napoleon were its founders. The First World War demonstrated that it was no match for the industrial nation state, which has been a remarkable success. It reached its apogee in 1990 when the long war fought over which system, communist, fascist, or parliamentary, would be the rightful model of this order was finally settled. But almost immediately, threats to the fundamental legitimacy of this order began to appear. These challenges include a global system of electronic communications, about which we've heard a good deal at this conference, that prevents any state from controlling its culture, that penetrates every society, that empowers social networking technology that it cannot control, an international system of trade and finance that prevents any state from thoroughly managing its national economy, which brings increased vulnerability as well as wealth to every state that arises not from its decisions, but from the decisions of the pitiless market. A system of international human rights that preempts any state's national laws and has been the basis for armed attack on states that pose no threat to any other state, but appeared to be, or were, in the process of attacking their own people ruthlessly. Transnational threats like AIDS and SARS or climate change, global non-national terrorism that no state can hide from or arrest by its own efforts alone. And finally, the commodification of weapons of mass destruction, where crucial components can be either sold or bartered on a clandestine market or simply downloaded via the internet, such as the information by which mousepox could be turned into a human pathogen. All of these developments are the results of policies that the parliamentary nation-states deployed to win the long war against fascism and communism. Industrial nation-states used law and regulation to tame the market. State-owned enterprises abounded. Most industrial nation-states had a national health service, a system of public universities with negligible fees. Banks were heavily regulated. The price of gold was negotiated by states. Currencies were pegged to a fixed value. The movement of capital was heavily regulated. But with the end of the long war of the 20th century, all this began to rapidly change, and a new insurgent order began to emerge. This constitutional order, the market state, relied on markets rather than attempting to control them. It was based on the premise that success in the post-long war world would accrue to the state that maximized its total wealth. And the way to do that was to maximize the opportunities for all citizens, regardless of race, sex, sexual orientation, even health and disability. New policies and practices began to appear as harbingers of this new order. For example, when states go from a reliance on regulation so characteristic of nation states to deregulating not just industries, but much more importantly, women's reproduction. When states move from conscription to all volunteer forces to raise armies, as all the most powerful states of NATO have done. When states end their policies of tuition-free higher education in favor of top-up fees and merit-based scholarships. When we go from direct transfers like the dole or unemployment compensation to providing job training to enter the labor market. When state-owned enterprises vanish and are replaced by sovereign wealth funds. When regimes of direct democracy like referenda, recall votes, voter initiatives begin to spread in preference to representational systems which appear to be discredited. In all of these instances, we are seeing the beginnings of a change in the constitutional order. This is what happened at Augsburg in 1555, at Osnabrück and Munster in 1648, at Utrecht in 1713, at Vienna in 1815, what was attempted at Versailles in 1919, all of which ratified the triumph of an insurgent constitutional order over the status quo. Suffice it to say that the ferocity and polarization within industrial nation-states today is the direct consequence of this birth struggle. We should remind ourselves that nation-states were no friends to nationalism despite their name. Rather, they exalted a particular nation. The English and the United Kingdom are a good example, and suppressed other nations within the state ruthlessly. Market states, by contrast, encouraged nationalism in two ways. First, they abandoned the sense of a single polity held together by adherence to fundamental shared values. This is most offensive to those groups of which the dominant nation is composed. Second, market states provide the economic and defense umbrella within which smaller nations can flourish. Catalonia, the Basque region, Lombardy, Scotland are all examples. And as the hitherto dominant nation recedes, it has the option of devolving into itself. And thus we see for the first time in England the increasingly widespread display of the flag of St. George. Please note that this conflict, or congeries of conflicts, is not a left-right matter. when the left seeks affirmative action and the right wants to ban abortion, when the left wants to make hate speech a crime and the right criminalizes drug use. These are examples of groups trying to write their moral preferences into law, and as such, they are quintessentially the practices of nation states. Market states are largely indifferent to the norms of justice, or for that matter, to any particular set of moral values. They are indifferent to values of loyalty, reverence for sacrifice, political competence, privacy, and the family. And they pose this challenge to civil society. Either these values must be supported without government backing, or we will replace them with the values of the market, which seem to me largely to exalt entertainment and the accumulation of wealth. The importance for this development to this conference lies in the interesting fact that terrorism tracks the constitutional order. It was quite a common thing after 9/11, particularly for an American living in Europe, to hear the following sort of mini lecture. We understand terrorism. We've had to live with it. Americans don't understand this because they've been spared terrorism. We know that you don't fight terrorism with defense departments and airplanes and tanks because we know terrorism. Well, maybe. What the Europeans know is 20th century industrial nation-state terrorism. They know the IRA, the PKK, the FLN, the PLO. That's what they know. I never in that period ever heard a European talk about the sack of Antwerp in 1573 by Catholic mercenaries, or the sack of Rome in 1527 by Lutheran mercenaries. No one ever mentioned the sea beggars of the 17th century, the Barbary pirates of the 18th century, even the anarchists of the 19th century, all very potent terrorist forces that tracked the constitutional orders that they attacked. So the importance for us is, if market states are characterized by privatization, outsourcing, devolution, if they're global, if they are electronically networked, if they're multinational, then you can expect a terrorism that is multinational, is electronically networked, is global, that privatizes and outsources its attacks, and that is devolved. For me, there is the largest significance in the emergence of market state terror groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. That's because globalized network terror is both a consequence of the appearance of the market state, but also a driver of its discrediting of the nation state, which cannot cope with market state terror. I'm not exaggerating, I think, the importance of this shift. For 5 centuries, only a state could threaten the existence of another state. Only states could keep large armies in the field, sometimes for decades, could develop ever more lethal technologies, could forge multi-generational alliances. And that's still true, but it won't be true for long. It will soon be possible for relatively small groups of relatively poorly funded political and social bases to bring any state, even the most powerful states, to their knees. Because we haven't appreciated how state evolution changed the relationship between terror and the state, between law and strategy, we thought that law had to be applied rather than adapted to strategic developments. An ACLU lawyer recently described the targeted killing of Anwar al-Awlaki as a bizarre death penalty case in which there was no indictment and no trial. We thought that law was irrelevant to strategy, so we didn't see that torture and the humiliations at Abu Ghraib were in fact defeats as important as defeats in conventional battles. We thought the Islamic State belonged in shudder quote. Do you know what I mean by that? You know what a shudder quote is? Sometimes you say, well, you watch me play tennis, and you say, he's really some tennis player, right? It's a way of indicating doubt about the truth of the assertion. And so we thought the Islamic State, right? Couldn't be a state. It was virtual. It kept popping in and out of territoriality. What sort of a state is that? Not a Westphalian state, and that's the only kind of state there is, right? We have no plan that will arrest the steady decline of the industrial nation state as it becomes more and more vulnerable, financially and strategically, and as it more and more sorts out its population into voluntarily segregated communities of the like-minded. Worst of all, our definition of terrorism leads to the insidious and enervating conclusion that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. We have failed to connect the various separate events as to what is driving them as well as reflecting them, and that is a change in the constitutional order. Only connect. This famous phrase of E.M. Forster's is laden with emotion, born in part of the frustration he felt as he watched his contemporaries try to overcome the Victorian reticence that seems to have isolated classes, sexes, even idealist and realist. Only connect, Forster wrote, that was her whole sermon. Only connect the prose and the passion, and both will be exalted, and human love will be seen at its height. Live in fragments no longer. Only connect, and the beast and the monk, robbed of the isolation that is life to either, will die. If any of you have read, or maybe you've seen The Remains of the Day, you'll recognize that this lack of emotional connectivity, reinforced by a fear of embarrassment, did not vanish in 1910. What might surprise you, however, is Forster's fear that technological advances, for him, photography, the tram, the motor car, even the telephone, would make us more isolated, that it would increase our sense of individuation rather than making us more interconnected. Like email or Twitter, we have more ways of expressing ourselves to others, but so much less to say. Like the World Wide Web and Wi-Fi, we have access to more information, but are curiously reinforced in the stubborn prejudices we brought to the keyboard in the first place. Live in fragments? What could be a better description of messages that are restricted to 140 characters? This afternoon, I wanted to suggest that this habit of disconnecting, of failing to see the overall shape of things because we are captivated and sometimes comforted and reinforced by their particulars, that this has crippled us in our understanding of terror and indeed of the events of the entire post-Cold War period. We have watched with some care as unexpected events have crushed, one by one, our expectations and hopes for this period. And yet we continue to be surprised. I might cite Brexit and Donald Trump's election, because we have not connected these events to an overall picture of our political and moral condition. Only connect.